Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in this wonderful world of ours. I hope you're safe, sound, and above all, healthy. I'm Aaron David Miller, a senior fellow at Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, and welcome to Carnegie Connects, a series of virtual discussions, and some in person. This morning is quite special, on issues of critical importance to America and to the world. Bill Burns, it's really honor, privilege, means a lot to me. 5 years of Carnegie Connects is great. Wonderful. 45 years of interacting with you over the course of a career, really quite extraordinary. From our excellent adventure at the Umayyad Mosque in Damascus to Embassy Amman to the extraordinary years of Bush 41 and James Baker, to the Bush 43 years, Arafat, Sharon, Zinni. You've been there, a source of inspiration for me, a friend, and an extraordinary reflection, example of what it means to be selfless and to be a public service. Dan Kurtzer, David Satterfield are here, Will Embry. They all worked and served with you. You're a national treasure, and I know you don't take compliments easy, but please take this one. I want to begin with a little more of the Bill Burns story. You know this story. The late Madeleine Albright tells it about herself. Apparently, after she was Secretary of State, transiting through London, one of her travel documents was not correct. So the Brits started questioning her. And at one point she said, "Do you know who I am?" And the British customs official coolly replied, "No, but we have really good doctors that can help you figure that out." So I guess that would be my first question, Bill Burns.
I know where you're going with this one.
What? I mean, I interviewed Ken Burns, and he talked. His mom died at a very early age, and he basically said, "You know, I've been raising the dead in all of my work. Who am I trying to talk to, really?" So just in terms of your background, what drove and empowered and shaped you?
Sure. Well, first, Aaron, it's wonderful to be here with you and to be back at Carnegie, which is a wonderful institution that I was very proud to lead for 6 years. And as you know, the feeling is entirely mutual in terms of my admiration and respect for you. And I'm delighted to be here on the 5th anniversary of Carnegie Connects. We were colleagues when you launched this podcast, and so it's really nice 5 years later to be back as a friend and former colleague here too. I grew up in an Army family. My dad was a career Army officer and really was inspired by him to enter public service later on. I remember when I was in graduate school and was trying to figure out what I was going to do with my professional life, my father wrote me a note, which was, sounds kind of antique right now, writing handwritten notes. But I remember one line in particular. He said, "Nothing can make you prouder than to serve your country with honor." And I've spent the last 4 decades, learning the wisdom and that advice. I entered the Foreign Service shortly before we first met in the beginning of 1982. And, had an incredibly fortunate career as a diplomat and then at CIA. People always ask, especially sort of eager young professionals, how do you get ahead? What's the route to success? And I hate to burst their balloons, but serendipity always plays an important role. I mean, you have to work hard, learn your trade, learn your profession, but then take advantage of opportunities. And you and I were both very lucky, for example, working for Jim Baker when he was Secretary of State at a remarkable moment in history too. And then, after 3.5 decades in the Foreign Service, I was incredibly lucky after my time leading Carnegie to become director of the CIA, which, as many of you, I see some former colleagues here, know is a tough crowd. In fact, one former senior CIA officer, a friend of mine, once said that the attitude of the CIA workforce waiting for a new director is kind of like the Scottish tribes waiting for the English king. So, like I said, it's a tough crowd. But I came as an outsider. I was the first career diplomat to lead that incredible organization. But I worked really hard to earn people's trust. I mean, I traveled more than 1 million miles around the world, and most of that was focused on seeing my colleagues, our officers, doing really hard jobs in really hard places, and then coming back and telling their stories to the president and my colleagues in the cabinet, as well as to members of Congress too. So yeah, as you can tell, I loved that experience just as I loved my earlier experience at State.
The Baker years, you reminded me in terms of preparation of Baker's 5 Ps.
Yeah.
Prior preparation prevents poor performance.
Yeah, actually, I remember it as 7 Ps. It was preparation plus perspiration prevents piss poor performance, which is a little more like Baker than
More colorful.
Yeah.
I want to talk about the future, but I want to step back and spend a few minutes on the past. Faulkner wrote in Requiem for a Nun, the past is never over, it's never even past. Your first book was called Back Channel, and it dawned on me that watching you over the last 4 years, that your work coincided with the 3 greatest and gravest crises that the Biden foreign policy crises that the Biden administration faced: Afghanistan, Russia, Ukraine, and Gaza. So I just wonder if you could, without revealing anything that might go in a book at some point, what roles did you play in those 3 conflicts?
Well, I mean, and start with Afghanistan. The withdrawal of the U.S. from Afghanistan, principally the U.S. military, but also intelligence officers and diplomats in the summer of 2021 was an incredibly painful experience on a number of different levels. For CIA, an institution and a workforce that had invested heavily in that conflict over 20 years after the atrocities of 9/11, it was painful to be withdrawing. And I remember the president sent me to Kabul in late August of 21, so just before, the final withdrawal or retrograde. And I was incredibly impressed with the professionalism of the officers I served with, the way in which they managed that withdrawal, whatever their personal views of it. I still remember the scene of, meeting. I had been sent to see the Taliban leadership to try to ensure that they allowed us to withdraw as gracefully as we could, which turned out to be not too graceful. I remember meeting Mullah Baradar outside the old Kabul International Airport, and I had like 24 security people with me, 24 of his Taliban security people. A month before, they would have been firing at each other. So I thought, oh, this is great. I'm going to set off an international incident here, because they were all had their fingers on their triggers. But it went okay. But the one thing I was proudest of is that, we had a profound obligation to Afghan partners who had worked, served, bled with us and their families over many years. And we worked really hard to ensure that they were safely taken out of Afghanistan too in that period. And that meant a lot to me personally and to our workforce too. And I think that's, in public service, those are the kind of obligations that you have to take really seriously.
Russia, Ukraine, I do want to talk about craft
Yeah.
and the use of intelligence to counter false flags, disinformation.
Yeah.
But what about your role in Russia, Ukraine, in the lead up to the war?
Yeah, well, I'm really proud of the role that CIA played, not me, but we did what any good intelligence service, any good intelligence community is supposed to do. We provided credible, accurate early warning of what was coming. We had collected, I think what's called exquisite intelligence in the intelligence community, a really graphic sense of what Putin was planning, coupled with the sense of some wonderful analysts at CIA and my own sense over the years, having served twice in Moscow and dealt with Putin a lot over 25 years, that he was dead serious this time. The president sent me at the beginning of November of 2021 to talk to Putin and some of the knuckle draggers around him about and lay out in, again, pretty precise detail what we knew about their planning and what the consequences would be if he went ahead with that. I found Putin utterly unapologetic, and I came back even more convinced that he was going to invade. And then I think the credibility of our intelligence, because it was a pretty lonely period. Only we and, really our colleagues at MI6, the Brits, were convinced that this invasion was coming. There were a lot of skeptics amongst some of our closest allies about this, whether Putin was just bluffing or whether he was really serious. But the credibility of our intelligence, I think, helped the president and policymakers to build a strong coalition. It certainly helped us to support the Ukrainians. And I think you have to go back to 2014 after Putin's illegal annexation of Crimea, when we first, as an agency, started working closely with our Ukrainian partners, that paid off in significant ways when the Russians invaded and contributed, I think, to the Ukrainians' ability to withstand that as well. And then finally, I think it was the decision of the president to declassify some of our secrets and use that to expose Putin's planning and to deny him the ability to create false narratives, which I had watched over him do all too often over many years. Oftentimes we never caught up with that too. So I think you have to be very careful about that. Washington is a place where people think anything worth doing is worth overdoing. It's easy to dry up sources and methods if you're not careful. But I think it paid dividends, and I think there are a lot of lessons in the intelligence experience in Ukraine that are going to pay off in the years ahead. With Putin, I had known and interacted with him for many years, for a quarter century really, before he launched his invasion. I always had known him to have a singular fixation on controlling Ukraine and its choices. He believed that Russia could not be a great power. He believes to this day. Russia can't be a great power. He can't be a great Russian leader unless he controls Ukraine and its choices. And he was absolutely determined. He saw this as his moment. The winter of 21-22, he thought was favorable tactically. He had a dim view of European ability to sort of respond in support of Ukraine. I think he had an equally dim view of the likelihood that we would. He thought he had sanctions-proofed the Russian economy. He thought he had modernized the Russian military to the point where he'd roll right over the Ukrainians. Those were fundamentally flawed assumptions, but part of the lesson for me was, those flawed assumptions come out of a very closed decision-making process in which, as I watched Putin over the years, going back to the time I was ambassador, more than 15 years ago now, as his grip on power tightened and as his circle got smaller, and by the launch of the invasion in Ukraine, that circle of people who were actually privy to the planning for the war was tiny, and it was made up of people who either shared Putin's hard-nosed views or had learned a long time ago that it wasn't career-enhancing to challenge his judgments. And his sense of destiny, his cockiness, had also deepened as well. I'm enormously proud of what we were able to do as an agency in particular to support the Ukrainians. We were the only US government agency that was on the ground throughout the whole conflict. President Zelensky, every time I met with him, always reminded me of that, and it built a real bond of trust. I traveled to Ukraine 14 times when I was director, which was a mark of far more than any other single place, and it was a mark of not just my commitment, but the commitment of my agency and of the United States. And Zelensky, who, as many of you know, was trained in entertainment before he, moved into politics, never lost his sense of humor despite all the burdens of his job. And on my 10th trip, I think it was like a year and a half ago, gave me a certificate entitling me to a free upgrade on the train from the Polish frontier to Kyiv. Turned out to be same train, same seat, but it was a nice gesture anyway, too. So,
a word on Gaza before we move to your transition from state to CIA. You dealt with David Barnea, head of Mossad, the Qataris, the Egyptians. I'm assuming there were no, unlike this administration, there were no direct contacts with Hamas's external leadership. But the premise of your work was freeing the hostages, ending the war, and it was you were forced, I suspect, into a series of partial agreements, in large part because the mutual endgames of Hamas and the Netanyahu government were mutually exclusive. What were your takeaways on those negotiations?
Well, a couple at least. I mean, first, this was not an abstraction for me or I think for anybody else who was engaged directly in the negotiations. This was a very human issue, human in the sense of the horrific plight of hostages and their families held by Hamas, the hostages, the horrific plight of Gazan civilians caught in a terrible crossfire as well. And human also in the sense that ultimately this was about decisions that leaders on both sides could make. And after the horrific terrorist attack on October 7th of 2023, it was entirely understandable. The mood in Israel, I remember 6 months, a year later, I'd be talking to Arab leaders, and their view was sort of more forward-looking. For Israelis, for understandable reasons, October 7th was still yesterday. So there was a sort of powerful set of human emotions to get through, too. But in the end, it came down to decisions made by leaders or not made. And I've thought for a long time that this wasn't just about the, art of the frameworks that all of us tried to put together. I mean, the framework that we had put together by the spring of 2024 bore a striking resemblance to what was finally agreed in January of 2025, just before the transition from Biden to Trump, and still bears a resemblance to what's on the table right now. There's a crying need to end the conflict. I don't see any military point to it at this stage. And you hear a lot of Israeli voices who say the same thing, voices I respect. And the cost in terms of destroying the chances to save hostages who are still alive, to destroy thousands and thousands of Gazan lives right now, far outweighs whatever the dubious military benefits of continuing this are. I think Hamas is no longer a strategic threat to Israel in the sense of being able to carry out the terrible act that they carried out on the 7th of October. It's no longer a strong strategic tool of Iran.
Yeah.
And one of the key ingredients, as many of you in this room know, is who governs Gaza after the end of the conflict. And one of the great stumbling blocks is being able to develop support for a credible non-Hamas Palestinian leadership, technocratic leadership that almost inevitably has to have some loose connections to the Palestinian Authority on the West Bank with all of its many flaws. And, in a sense, I think both Prime Minister Netanyahu and a succession of, leaders of Hamas going back to Yahya Sinwar have been mutual enablers in wanting to avoid dealing with that question. And I'm not trying to suggest, I know how hard this is. I know, certainly from the outside, it's much easier said than done. But I think that in many ways is one of the core issues right now, because without that, it's very hard to imagine how you get Gulf Arabs to contribute to economic recovery, which will be a mammoth task in Gaza, let alone trying to provide security. Yeah. But I don't think it's impossible, and I think that's what, at this moment, I think, American diplomacy has to face up to.
I know you spent a lot of time with the president, and the line between policy and intelligence, offering an intelligence assessment on one hand, offering advice on the other. Was there ever a time when the president looked at you from any of these trips, let's talk about Gaza, and he said, Bill, I understand the assessment, thank you very much, but what do you think we should do?
Yeah, I mean, I was always very careful when I was, the 4 years I was director of CIA, to understand what my role was. It was not to be a policymaker, it was to support and enable policymakers. But, my rule was I wouldn't volunteer views like that, but if the president asked, I'd be honest with them too. I thought that was something, that I was obliged to do. Every time on all those many, many trips overseas I took, always on the plane ride back would write a letter to the president, I tried to do it in a kind of conversational style because presidents are really busy people. And so if you write it in bureaucratese, you can be sure it's going to get tuned out. But, to offer some reflections on the characters I was dealing with, many of whom were his counterparts, to tell the stories of, what CIA officers had achieved and their courage and their skill. And then, sometime at least to offer the assessment that, I thought should underpin sound policy choices, which, as you know better than anyone, Aaron, are, in the Middle East, always between bad and worse.
Yep. Let's move on now, transition from state to CIA. Is it more fun being a diplomat or a spy?
I'm always very careful about that because I don't want to antagonize people for whom I have enormous respect in both institutions. I loved being director of CIA, as you can probably tell from my comments. It's a different culture. State, and I say this with great fondness, can sometimes be a kind of passive-aggressive place. Even when I was Deputy Secretary, the #2 in the State Department, if you ask for something, oftentimes people will think, well, if he's really serious, he'll ask again. At the CIA, what I learned early on, I tended to muse a little bit out loud in meetings. And what I discovered by the end of the day, I'd get a 14-page single-spaced action plan. For all I knew, there were planes flying and everything else. So I stopped musing and thinking out loud after a while. But it is a very agile place. It prides itself not just on its dedication to mission, but also on not just admiring problems, but trying to get things done whenever they're directed by policymakers. And it's an agency that operates in the shadows almost by definition, out of sight, out of mind, never gets much public attention except when we screw up, in which case there's all too much public attention. But I took that as as part of my responsibility was to lift up the stories of people in CIA, not just, privately with the president and on Capitol Hill, but also where I could publicly, and then also to communicate with my workforce too. So on all those plane rides home, right after I wrote the letter to the president, I would write a letter to our workforce. And I would try to explain, these were classified, but you're always taking a chance, sort of being candid about what you saw, what you were trying to do. But Leon Panettig, who was one of my predecessors at CIA, many other experiences as a public servant, told me, I remember in the transition before I assumed the role at CIA, that communication is something you really need to focus on. You're used to being a diplomat at the State Department where people can often read in the media where the Secretary of State's going or anything else. They couldn't, at least most of the time, do that with the director of CIA. So it was important for me not just to do those notes, but also to wander. And I love, just as Dan mentioned about the State Department, sort of wandering the hallways and cold calling analysts. I know you had that experience when you were INR.
Right.
But I did it as a mark of respect because I wanted to hear directly from analysts for whom I had great admiration what they thought about issues. I knew I would eventually get their sort of carefully coordinated memos, most of which were really good. But I wanted to hear from them too. And so I'd wander down to their offices or vaults. And I really enjoyed that too. After every trip, I'd go, talk to the officers who had done all the preparation for the trip too, because I wanted them to be able to ask me questions about how did those talking points work? But so it was fun.
If good and effective policy bill is finding the balance between the way the world is on one hand and the way any administration wants it to be on the other, critical to the success of that process is looking at the world the way it is and dealing with intelligence, non-politicized, with no constraints in terms of presenting the reality of the situation. I'm jumping ahead, but I think it's not a bad transition. When you were the first Foreign Service officer, career Foreign Service officer to be appointed head of CIA, you restored, in my view, a degree of credibility and integrity and honesty to the process of analysis. After it had taken a sort of 4-year vacation under the previous administration. You are now faced with what you could only describe as a blatant politicalization of intelligence. The firing of NSA and CIA officials. Senator Warner can't visit the national NGA because the Pentagon has blocked his trip. There doesn't appear to be any oversight. How bad, and you'll be able to judge this based on your last 4 years, how bad is what we're watching on the issue of politicalization of the intelligence community? Having talked about Tulsi Gabbard, we don't, and the DNI.
Yeah.
It's not an academic exercise. You got to get the attitudes and actions of your friends and adversaries right. And it's got to go to the president, regardless of the policy constraints or busting certain predispositions or mythologies that a president, or strongly held views that a president had.
No, it's a really important question and a deeply troubling one too, because I think, for all the challenges on the international landscape, we've discussed several of them, for all the risks that are out there, I still think the United States, even though we're no longer the only big kid on the geopolitical block, has a better hand to play than any of our rivals. But that depends on a couple of things in particular, in addition to a healthy economy and our ability to innovate in technology, all the kinds of things that at our best will set us apart from our rivals. But those two things are, first, the fact that we have a network of allies and partners, and at least today, our principal rivals in China and Russia don't. It's not self-sustaining. You have to realize the importance of those alliances and partnership relations and invest in them. And it takes a lot of effort to piss off the Canadians, which is what we've accomplished. It actually takes a lot of effort, too, to drive Narendra Modi, the Prime Minister of India, to the point where he's sitting around the table holding hands with Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping, for whom he has deep strategic suspicions. And so I think that's one thing we have to be really careful about, because trust is at the core of those alliances and partnerships. And if you erode that, it can be very difficult to rebuild. And the second concern is the point that you raised, Aaron. It's about public institutions. And I wrote a piece in The Atlantic a couple of weeks ago, which I thought hard about because I'm not a partisan person. I served 6 presidents, 3 Republicans, 3 Democrats. But I was a career public servant for almost 40 years. And I worry deeply about what's happening to honorable career public servants who are apolitical. And the way in which, under the guise of a reform process, it really has turned into more of a campaign of retribution and creating fear. Yeah. Fear in the sense of creating a culture that's about looking over your shoulder, about should I speak truth to power, should I convey very directly views that may be contrary to what policymakers want to hear. That is not an easy thing to do. I've sat in the Oval Office and had conversations when I was at CIA with the president, with other senior policymakers, and it's not easy to do that. But that is incumbent upon the CIA and any good intelligence community. I have great faith in the integrity of officers who are still serving there, analysts and operations officers, and their determination to continue to do that. But if you continue to take some of the steps, which really are about retribution and sowing fear, you can have a very chilling effect on people over time. And that's something that I think, we have to be really careful about.
I mean, again, let's just jump right into this, because I wonder if you could share your views on what we're watching now. The Constitution talks about perfecting a more perfect union. It doesn't talk about perfecting a more perfect world. You spend your entire life in foreign policy. Mm-hmm. And yet the real challenges to the Republic are not abroad. As difficult as they are, we can do more than one thing at a time, but it is the aggrandizement of presidential power on a level, on a scale we've never seen before. It's the erosion of norms and institutions, of constitutional governance in America. I know you would tend to be on the upbeat side on this, but I just wonder. Well, let me read something you wrote out of the Atlantic article, because I think it gets at the question.
Probably not so upbeat.
And by the way, if you haven't read the article, it's August 20. Bill Burns. It's called "A Letter to America's Discarded Public Servants." Here's what you say. There's still a chance that the next generation will serve. The next generation, right? That's 20 years. Mm-hmm. The next generation will serve in a world where we curb the worst of our current excesses, stop betraying the ideals of public service, stop firing experts just because their stats are unwelcome, stop blowing up institutions that matter to our future. There is still a chance that the next generation could be present at the creation of a new era for America in the world in which we're mindful of our many strengths, but more careful about our overreach. Mm-hmm. And it gets to the whole question of American leadership. But the real source of our resilience is here at home.
Yep.
And I don't know how to reconcile the two and where the real battles need to be fought. And I just wonder, what does the foreign policy community, what are their responsibilities and obligations in such a fraught environment where loyalty is critically important to service? Blind loyalty is a disaster, a catastrophe.
Yeah. No, I mean, and that's what authoritarian regimes do. They build closed decision-making systems. They cow their career public servants so that they're nervous or apprehensive about questioning the wisdom of decisions. And here I'm talking about questioning in our democratic system. I'm talking about questioning within the bounds, within the discipline of the system too. It's on rare occasions when officers, and I had huge admiration for many of them who resigned, whether it was over the Balkan, at the State Department over the Balkans in the 1990s, fewer over the war in Iraq in 2003, some over Gaza more recently. I have huge respect for that. Those are not easy decisions to make. I also have respect for people who continue to be honest within the system. But you have an obligation to do that, just as you have an obligation as a career public servant to carry out the choices that are made by an elected leadership. If you can't in good conscience do that, you can leave. But your equal obligation along the way is to be straight about your concerns in the interests of smarter policy choices too. So what I think is, really awful about some of the processes we've seen is that here you had officers in the State Department who were carrying out choices that weren't their preferences, did not reflect their professional advice, whether it was about blowing up the Fulbright Scholarship Program or part of it, or bringing in Afrikaners to this country and expelling, Afghans who had worked with us in Afghanistan. Whatever their personal views, they were carrying out those choices, and yet many of them were fired simply because of the office, the job they had at the time, career officers who tended to rotate amongst different offices. Same was true of officers at CIA, career officers working in diversity, equity, and inclusion programs.
Right.
I mean, it's one thing, it's a policy choice for a new administration to close programs like that. But these are officers who should have been allowed to rotate back to other parts of the agency too. So, those are the kind of things that I think are troubling and that we need to pay attention to and do all we can to highlight the downsides of them, not in a partisan way, but just in the long-term interests of the Republic.
Yeah.
And I think lots of other things too, because this is not just about national security in the narrow sense of the term. It's about, cutting funding for basic research and science, which, has been critical to the ability of the United States to compete effectively, to innovate in technology and other ways. Same is true in public health as well. And those are the kind of things that, that's going to make it much, much harder for us to compete successfully in a pretty unforgiving world right now.
Or dismantling USAID, or Mike Ramos is here, or VOA, for that matter.
No, I was talking to Michael earlier on VOA, and I just think, going back to the Baker time, and you and I tend to, probably, embellish that experience in some ways, but it really was a remarkable intersection of incredibly important international events, a real plastic moment in the world where the Cold War was ending, the Soviet Union collapsing, intersecting with statesmen who knew that America at its best, when we apply enlightened self-interest, employed both hard power and soft power. That was the secret, I think, to success in those years. And now I think we're way too fixated on the self part and less on the enlightened part. And I'm not trying to suggest we were always enlightened over the years. We got a lot of things wrong. But I think being conscious of the fact that this should not be all about blunt force diplomacy or hard power, that there are other tools that matter a great deal to our role in the world, the way in which we're seen by other people.
I mean, just last point in this, part of the problem is that the founders, I think, understood that in order to have effective self-governance, you needed a commitment to two things. Number one, you needed moral self-governance. An individual had to subordinate his or her own impulses, demons, to the second issue, which was public virtue. That it's about we, not me. And I mean, I struggle constantly. It's find a way, how do we lead in such a system with such a president? Leadership. You talked about America as a pivotal power. Madeleine Albright borrowed the phrase from Bill Clinton, an indispensable power. I think I once said to her that, quoting de Gaulle, that the cemeteries of France are filled with indispensable people.
I like pivotal.
Emma Ashford has a new book. She talks about America as first among equals. When you said pivotal power, what did you actually mean? And is it still relevant today? Should it be?
I mean, I think it still is, in the sense that, as I mentioned before, on the international landscape, it's just an objective fact that the United States doesn't enjoy the position of uncontested primacy that, we knew in the quarter century or so after the end of the Cold War.
Right.
I still think, I do not mean that as a pessimistic statement. I still do believe the United States, has a better hand to play than any of our rivals. But a lot of that hinges on our ability to sustain what is our comparative advantage, in a sense, today over China and Russia, and that is we have a network of allies and partners. And that's not an argument against getting our European allies to spend more on defense. It's a good thing. It's a credit to this administration that they've produced that. But we have to sustain and try to strengthen those alliances and partnerships. India is another example of this. I don't know if Ashley Tellis is here, but he's invested a lot in that issue, and I've learned a lot from him over the years. That's critically important. And then the other thing is what we were just talking about, and that is, the health of our own democratic system, the health of public institutions. There is a shortage of trust, how's that for a recovering diplomat to say, in public institutions these days. It's been true before the last election. So it's important for leaders to try to do what they can to rebuild that public trust, which is why, when I was at CIA, it's a little unusual to do things in public, but that was an important part of my job because people don't understand sometimes the sacrifices that are made, the quality of the people, their dedication, their courage in many, many instances around the world. And that is just as true for American diplomats.
Yeah. We have a few minutes left, so I want to ask you the question I'm sure you get. Hopefully it'll prompt a story. What keeps you up at night?
Oh, well, I learned, especially in the 4 years I was at CIA, that a certain amount of interrupted sleep comes with the territory. What keeps me up at night, honestly, what kept me up at night over those 4 years is risk and security. As I mentioned, I had, thousands of officers in whom I had great faith doing really risky jobs around the world. And I could, as director, along with the wonderful leadership team I had, try to anticipate that risk, to mitigate it, but I couldn't make it go away. And there's no risk-free approach to intelligence or to diplomacy for that matter, too. The second thing, what literally kept me up at night was about 2 summers ago, I guess, I volunteered on the spur of the moment to take part in the overnight exercise at the end of what's called the Special Operations Training Course, which is the first step for new case officers, operations officers, down at our training facility known as the Farm in Virginia. And it seemed like a good idea at the time. It ran from, I think, 6 p.m. to 6 a.m. About 3 a.m. in the deep, dark woods of Virginia, I was wondering if this was such a great idea. But it was fascinating for me to watch. There were about 60 new CIA operations officers, case officers, who were learning not just the tools of the trade and the profession, but teamwork and how to work with one another. And I remember, a number of those new officers were Navy SEALs, had a lot of military experience. So this special operations training course was not new to them. There was one woman who was 42 years old, a mother of 4, a new case officer, whom I watched over that night make just as many contributions to the success of her team in these simulations as anybody else. But what made this worth the price of admission was at 5 o'clock in the morning, the Delta Force from Fort Bragg, North Carolina, flew up to stage a hostage rescue mission. They had been told that There were a dozen or so CIA officers who were being held by hostile power. So it was worth the price of admission to watch the look on the face of the very impressive young Army major leading this Delta Force team come running up the stairs, weapon ready, to see a real-life CIA director tied to a chair. So, that kept me up that night, but it was a really memorable experience, one of the highlights.
I just want to close by saying a couple things. I'm also going to read the last paragraph of your article. Jack Kennedy described himself at one point as an idealist without illusion. I look at the world that way. Never giving up on never saying never. We don't have the right to say never. My kids, my grandkids, I can't mortgage their future by condemning them, let alone, in my case, the Arabs and the Israelis, Palestinians, to a future of permanent confrontation and violence. It's morally unconscionable to do that because, Bill Burns, we can't see what's in front of us. We really don't know, and we can't predict. But I'd like to think that you are an idealist without illusion. And let me just read the last paragraph of the Atlantic article. But what I do not doubt is the embodied importance of public service and the value of what you have done with yours. This is to your colleagues. And I know that you will continue to serve in different ways, helping to stand watch, I love this line, over our great experiment, even as too many of our elected leaders seem to be turning their backs on it. It's wonderful advice. It suggests that we're not condemned to a dystopic future in this republic. It's going to take an enormous amount of hard work. A lot of the people in this room, and hopefully, Bill Burns, at some point, by you again, guiding the foreign policy in some way of the republic. Thanks for
Great to see you, Aaron.
a lot, Bill.
Thank you very much. Thank you.